I would like to show my respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which these interviews take place. I would also like to respectfully acknowledge the Wangal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work.
We still have arranged marriages in the South Asian community and as well as the Sri Lankan community. So there is this big push to be seen a certain way. And my hypothesis is if one comes out and says, hey, I've experienced anxiety, or I've experienced depression, or I have gone through trauma, then whether they're going to be labelled as damaged goods.
I'm Prema, the host of this podcast, What Can We Do? In each episode, I speak to someone or an organization that's making impact. You will learn about the issue, why it exists, the challenges, but most importantly, how you can be a part of the solution. My hope is that you can take away 2 to 3 tips each episode that will support you in your helping journey. Today we're going to be hearing from Poonkulali Govintharajah. Hi Poonkulali, could you please introduce yourself?
Hello, so I'm Poonkulali Govintharajah. Thank you for having me today. I'm a psychologist and I've been working for over 15 years in government and non-government sectors, starting with child protection, sexual assault and immigration detention. Currently run my own private practice, focusing in all age groups, but particularly children and adolescents. I'm the founder of Thadam, and Thadam is a non-government organisation that's made up of like-minded individuals. We've all come from different walks of life. We've got GPs, we've got high school teacher, we've got university students, engineering, marketing, communication background. So different people who are very passionate around mental health have joined the team. We are all volunteering our time to basically create awareness within the Sri Lankan community by providing information around it through various means. One could be through resources that we've got on our website, thadam.com.au, which the information is bilingual, Tamil and English, but also we create content using our digital space, Facebook, as well. At this point in time, we'll be going into YouTube as well around some of the issues that we are tackling that would have a mental health aspect to it.
And what is the aim of Thadam or the mission of Thadam?
To destigmatize mental health, to have normalized conversations around this as well, to provide information around mental health issues, and also by doing all of this to raise awareness around mental health.
If we go back to the start, what motivated or what pushed you to start an organization like Thadam?
The motivation for me came about from my own frustrations of working within my community and knowing my community is a really hardworking, proud, generous community. So I know all of that in terms of lived through that and also having been a recipient of that. But the flip side of it is the pride also somewhat gets in the way. And what I started noticing is in my own work as a psychologist in private practice or in other organizations, when I meet a Sri Lankan or someone from a South Asian background, we tend to minimize the issues and we don't necessarily say everything that we need to say, which then leads to more crisis for that individual. Early intervention support is not necessarily given because the narrative is not necessarily very strong or not everything has been given. What I also noticed with younger people and children is they felt that they didn't have a voice. They couldn't say much at home. They tend to wear a mask, I would call it. They would speak to perhaps their peers or friends at school. And generally what I noticed would happen is unless the school intervenes and highlights perhaps what the issues are, only then the parent would do something about it. So I guess it was more that crisis kind of pointy end things that I started seeing, as opposed to things that could have started off, which could have been dealt with quite easily before it gets to that point.
What happens in a community when there isn't sort of healthy dialogue around mental health? Because you said a lot of the times it reaches crisis point. So in the case of the community you're from, what does that look like?
Crisis point would look like self-harming. It would look like further fragmentation in family dynamics. That means, the child is perhaps not reaching out to the parents. The parents are not necessarily aware of what's happening in the child's world. It could be the their mental health has further deteriorated. So therefore, their symptoms could be a lot more profound in terms of what they're going through. Their behaviours could be changing. Their world may have shrunk a lot further because they've probably withdrawn from their support networks. They're possibly having thoughts of, this is all a bit too much. What's the point anymore? I really cannot see any point of going through this emotional pain. So these are some of the things that would come out.
And I know earlier you said broader, it was about the South Asian community, although a lot of the work kind of started from your home community, the Sri Lankan Tamil community. We know South Asian communities are quite conservative or quite, perhaps not as forthcoming in these types of conversations about mental health. However, with the Sri Lankan Tamil community, there's a very unique set of circumstances that make this even more complex.
All of us, we've gone through at some point, whether it be first generation or second generation, we've all been touched by the civil war in Sri Lanka. So with my parents, they've been touched on, and that's the reason why they've had to leave. Everyone's got their own stories about why they've left and where they've gone. When I say the second generation, even though I have not experienced it directly, I have experienced it indirectly because my parents have gone through it. So therefore, their way of perhaps their core beliefs or the way they respond or their thought processes would have been touched by that trauma. So I guess there is that intergenerational trauma that we all till to date are living with. And I guess it's more around more light and more conversations we have around that so that we can limit this to continue to the next generation.
What does intergenerational trauma, I mean, I hear it a lot. What does it actually mean? What does it actually look like?
So intergenerational trauma. So in terms of that particular generation, what they'd gone through and what they'd witnessed in terms of the Civil War, I guess we could sit here for many hours talking about that. But in terms of the impact, it can psychologically impact the level of trust that the person has for anyone outside their own family dynamics because of perhaps what has happened to them. There could easily be a lot of anxiety around what to do, where to go about, accessing things and support. One could be rather wary of also accessing support. These are some of the things I'm not going to. I mean, this is like a whole nother topic that we could go into, but it's just some of the things I guess that one would notice that one could take away with them into whatever country they go into and into their family as well. So, for example, if they're constantly in this state of distrust, or let's just take that for example, and if they've left their country and come to another country, they're accessing support or being open to another person saying, hey, I need support with this with my child, or even going up to a GP and being very candid can be quite difficult for them because it could be around, how is this person going to view me? How am I going to be judged? Is this information going to be just between me and the GP, or is it going to be going out into the community? A large part of it, and everyone here are high functioning people who've got jobs, who run families, and but there is this underlying level of distrust, and that could be one of the legacies of trauma if we were to give an example.
So, with first generation and second generation Sri Lankan Tamil Australians, what sort of support is Thadam providing that perhaps mainstream services have not been able to provide to date?
One of the biggest things that Thadam wants to provide is providing mental health through a cultural lens, because mainstream, there's obviously a lot of great organisations out there, Beyond Blue, Lifeline, lots of resources that are out there. But what I noticed in my line of work and generally within the community is not necessarily that's accessed. One is perhaps limited knowledge. Two is the language barrier. Three is not that no one can speak English or everyone can speak English and understand, but they prefer to talk in their own language. And also the cultural lens. So I'll give an example of if a young person of 18 or 19 or 20 are having issues with their parents, through a cultural lens, be more around, okay, obviously depending on what the issues are, it will be more around, okay, let's try to figure out how we can work through this. Perhaps let's access, other supports, or perhaps someone in the family dynamics that are seen as an elder that may have a bit more weight with mum and dad. And I guess there will be a bit more perseverance in terms of trying to figure this out and trying to get the young person to understand it from the parents' perspective and the parents to understand from the young person's perspective. Whereas looking at from a Western kind of construct where it's more around the individual as opposed to it being the family unit, it could be more around, hey, you're 19 or 20, you've got all rights to leave your home, you can go and access X, Y, and Z, which again is taking away the cultural dimension of it all, which would then even further fragment that relationship as opposed to making it better.
Even generally, I think there's a growing awareness of, I don't know if this is the right term, culturally appropriate mental health services that,
Yes.
because I think a lot of people of color often say that especially if they go to a white therapist, that they spend half the session explaining their context of their culture and the family dynamics. So Thadam's providing information about mental health through a cultural lens. Mm-hmm. What is Thadam actually doing or putting out there into the community?
So at this stage, we started off in putting information using a digital space, and what that requires, or what we've been doing, is pretty much looking into creating content that would feed into some of these issues. So, for example, moving out, for example, is something that is, well recognised within the Australian community. And if anything, it's pushed to go, yes, but you're 18. Like, how can you still live with your parents? It's a bit like a shame of, what's wrong with you? You're so clingy, or some attachment issues there going, or, there's always this negative connotation. Whereas if you look at it more from a Sri Lankan community, or that cultural lens, is like, with pride, the parent would say, yes, we're all living together. No one's necessarily moving out. And if they're moving out, it's like, oh, what shame you've brought into this family. So I guess it's breaking down those things through content delivery, trying to speak about these things, but looking at it at two lenses. One from the generation that's brought up here, and also for the older generation, kind of giving them some fodder to start speaking about these difficult topics. So even if it is stuff that's happening at home, rather than being really highly agitated, highly, with a lot of emotionally charged conversation. If one can perhaps look at it as a third entity, by looking at something and go, hey, that resonates, and then perhaps having a conversation about that would then lead to more conversations about difficult topics, and then go into also gently introducing mental health issues as well, because that's also something that one doesn't talk about. So back to your question about how we're doing it, using digital space, creating content that resonates with generally that we've all had lived experience of, or things that others have told us, and then pretty much breaking it down in a way that is perhaps palatable, and then having further conversations about that.
How powerful or how useful is content in this space, and what made you kind of make that decision that, yes, we'll use content as that sort of first step?
I was very mindful of not coming across as lecturing and telling the community. So, in my own way, I guess the whole purpose of this is to deliver it in a non threatening way, number one. Number two is one of the things that we all do, psychologists and other mental health professionals, is one is to increase awareness and insight with the person that we're working with. So, the more awareness and insight they have about themselves, then there is going to be a greater push in terms of motivation to keep on working on whatever the issues are or whatever the concerns are that they've brought into that therapy room. So basically using that concept, but doing it as a whole, to the whole community, is let's build insight, let's build awareness. All this stuff everyone has gone through, but we're now kind of focusing on it to see, hey, let's look at this in different angles and let's see whether any of these things resonates. And it could resonate for you, or it could resonate based on a family member who's going through this. With that will come a sense of, and I'm hoping, engagement. So let's see what Thadam's doing next. Why did they say that? I'm curious. So engagement, curiosity, they were the main things.
What type of topics do you cover in your content?
It could be domestic violence. It could be things about anxiety, for example, what to look for, how does it present, what's the impact, perhaps what could you do, very general tips. We're not a therapy service. We're not going to give tailored advice, but it's just general things to look out for and what one can do. So that's one mode, but the other ones are more around looking into perhaps for parenting. What are the things to look for with someone who's 5 years old who are presenting with these certain behaviors? What could that mean? What could you do about it? And where does it, at what point do you then go, hey, I need to go and seek professional advice?
Mm-hmm. What has the response been like since you started Thadam? And when did you start Thadam?
Our first post was in May last year, 2021. What has the response been like? This is coming from someone who's a novice when it comes to social media, so I'll put that out there, the irony of it all. I've been told that at this stage we've got over 500 followers for Thadam. I've been told that's a good thing based on the time that we've got, like about 7 or 8 months we've been around. So if that is something to go by, what that tells me is there is a need, there is a gap, and there is people out there who clearly we are connecting with.
I guess, firstly, the unique thing is you started this organization during the pandemic, and I guess we're still in the pandemic.
Yes.
And I would think a lot of us, perhaps, who never thought about mental health or never thought about checking in with ourselves, might have been pushed to do so during this pandemic. So in launching this, did you get, because I think one thing you said was to get the lived experience. Were people more willing to share their experiences?
Yes, that was definitely a very, I guess, felt very privileged to see that, because I really did not think that could happen at this stage, because of the shame and stigma associated with it, and people were willing to, whether it be with video or audio, to go, yes, I will talk about it. I do want, let's say the young lady who did the talk around depression, one of her first things is, I do want, young women in their 20s to know that one can get through this. So there was a lot of passion that came out, and it was people who were wanting to reach out and tell their story to help someone else. So that was very strong.
This sort of a culture and a community that perhaps is not as open to conversations about mental health, is that only unique to the Sri Lankan Tamils and South Asian community?
Nope. Mainstream communities have it too, but I would say not to the level of how we have it. And I have my own hypothesis around that, and I am happy for someone to come out and go, that's not possibly right. But my hypothesis is we still have arranged marriages in the South Asian community. and as well as the Sri Lankan community. So there is this big push to be seen a certain way. And my hypothesis is if one comes out and says, hey, I've experienced anxiety, or I've experienced depression, or I have gone through trauma, then whether they're going to be labeled as damaged goods, and whether the prospect of marriage perhaps, or the family itself being judged as, oh well, they've got some head problems, or there is possibly that fear that could drive it being more underground as opposed to coming out and being very candid about it. Whereas the mainstream communities don't necessarily have that. But we are obviously moving away from arranged marriages, but still there is that whole concept of introductions and, are they coming from a good family, or, how is he or she? All those things are assessed.
What are some of the misconceptions people have about tackling mental health and mental health education within communities like this?
I think one of the misconceptions is if you go see someone professionally, everything about you will be out in the community. So this again, distrust of things can be kept confidentially, and we are legally and ethically bound to keep things confidential from a professional perspective. I think the other misconception is one doesn't have an issue. If one goes and sees a mental health professional, they're going to create issues in you.
You have to get your money's worth.
Another misconception is, what are they going to do? They're just going to talk. And how are they going to know you better than your own mum and dad knowing you?
Yeah.
Just the three that I've put on the table right now.
Yeah. And I guess also misconceptions within the home, that my experience is, if you say, look, I've got something bugging me, it's the common thing I used to hear from my father was, oh, it's because you're not occupying yourself, or because you have an idle mind. And you're like, I don't think so, because I have school, I'm working, I mean, I'm not from the Sri Lankan Tamil community, but South Asian. It's still a learning curve, but I see so much changing, and I don't know, I find it quite encouraging, and I don't know from your point of view if you see there's this positive trend and sort of a thirst for information around our mental health.
Definitely, and I see that a lot with the younger generation. Those of whom particularly who brought up in those two cultures and who've had that exposure with mainstream, because they do talk about this in primary school, particularly, what's mental health, what's, child protection issues. So they are exposed to it quite earlier on, which is fantastic. It's just more around how do you continue those conversations within the family dynamic so they don't get lost. And if something was to happen, the child or the young person can approach their parent and say, hey, this happened to me. Rather than thinking, wanting to protect their parents, or would I be believed, or how are they going to react? Like none of these three should be coming into that young person or little person's mind.
Mm-hmm. Is there a sense you find with, from your experience with older community members thinking it's too late for me to deal with my mental health stuff?
Yeah, you do get that. But at the same time, what I do notice, which is really exciting, is when they're wanting to help their children, whether they're 18 or 19 or 20, there are parents who are prepared to change, and there are parents who are prepared to put in the hard work and understand where their child is coming from. So that's the exciting bit. And I would say that with the Sri Lankan community, as well as the South Asian more generally, but more so because we are so focused on children and their future, because of that migrant mentality as well. They will do anything for their children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's one of, the most positive, one of the positive things is they will do anything for their children. It's just more around getting through to them to say, hey, this is not really scary and this can actually help. And one doesn't have to go and experience mental health issues to see a mental health professional. It could be about mental well-being. It could be just general well-being issues. It's like fueling the car.
What are some of the challenges in running an organization like Thadam and doing the kind of work you're trying to do and continuing to do?
The challenges are, I guess, for me, very mindful that Thadam doesn't come across as the parent telling everyone what to do. I'm very mindful of that. So that's something that I'm constantly in my back of my mind when we're delivering content, how we're coming across, and also being very mindful that we don't come across, none of our own lived experiences gets projected into that content and it doesn't have a negative flavor, trying as much to keep it neutral and then for people to decide where they sit with that content. The other challenge is just with, I guess, any startups, I guess, trying to get people to help us financially to do the things that we're doing, sustainability around that, getting the right people on board in terms of expertise, like project managers, graphic designers, videographers, other health professionals with their information, collaborators. So there's I guess getting the right people at the right time, because everyone's busy as well, would be one of the challenges as well, and also keeping true to our vision.
Mm-hmm. And currently, how are you funded?
Generous donations by community members and also through funding bodies.
And completely volunteer run, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So none of us get paid. And I think the inside joke is this is our second job, people. So let's just get on with it.
And if you had something to say to a parent whose child was going through something, but again, this parent comes from a culture where, or a community where it's hard to talk about these things, what would you say to them?
Listen. That's it. Listen. Um, because I know we're talking about a hypothetical situation, but what I know about South Asian parents is that, their whole life is about their child. So let's step into that. You've dedicated, you've sacrificed a lot for your child or your children. All you need to do at that point in time is listen and let them lead the show a little bit, because they would know more about it than you would. Even though with everything else in their life, you probably would have known a little bit more, but it's come to a stage where you would just have to play the role of following and them leading, and then getting the right professional, because the fit needs to be important as well when one's seeing a therapist, and then start working it collectively as a team.
Why is Thadam's work important?
Well, the question is, if one thinks mental health is important, then Thadam's work would be important. If one thinks that mental health is, if one's not coping mentally, then that has a ripple effect on one's relationships, one's work, one's schooling, one's day-to-day functioning. If one thinks that is all very important and mental health is important, then therefore Thadam is important.
If there was someone who finds themselves in a position similar to yours where they're in a community and they kind of understand the struggles of the community and they want to help in their professional capacity, what tips would you have for them? Like from the experience that you've had in setting up something like Thadam?
Getting the right team, that will be one, to ensure that you get like-minded people working with you and for the right reasons as well. And I guess also to have very transparent conversations with people who are not just with you in that team, but also with other possible connections that you may form in terms of what you want to do. Is there anyone who could help you get there? Because having a network of people is really important in getting this out. The third one is be prepared to have a lot of your days being occupied with this work, and just be prepared mentally for that, because when you get on that space, it's not easy to get out because you've already got the ball rolling. So unless you're prepared to do that, then get in.
Where would you like Thadam to be in about 5 years? The types of programs, the kind of work you might be doing with communities.
Yeah. In 5 years' time, I would really like it to be able to work with Thadam to be working with other community groups as well, particularly mainstream groups. I would really like Thadam to be the voice of the South Asian communities in regards to the issues in terms of running groups, whether it be with the cultural lens, that's very important, around domestic violence or other topics, perhaps anxiety, parenting, that again carries that cultural lens. So this is where I would like Thadam to be at in 5 years' time.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or follow it on social media. Your support will help this podcast reach more listeners. This podcast is produced by Samuham Media.